Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So welcome. Welcome. I'm glad you're all here. We're about to start the next session. It's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Kurtz, who's from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, and we're very happy to have him here. He's going to talk about the topic of machine-assisted thought. When I heard of the topic as part of the planning, I got so excited I said I have to chair that one because I don't want to miss it. So we're really looking forward to it. I wanted to let you know, as you may have noticed, we have a camera in the back. And therefore, when you're ready to have questions at the end of this session, I will come around with a microphone so we can capture the questions and the answers. So, Michael, please.
Okay, I guess it's on. All right, I'm going to talk about machine-assisted thought, and what I mean by that, I hope will slowly become clear through the talk. I should first thank my collaborators. These are people who all work on the ADS project. Alberto Akamazzi is the project manager. Edwin Henniken works on recommender systems and things like that with me. Jay Luker and Giovanni DeMilla work on the software and also the user interface along with Alberto. And Carolyn Grant actually puts all the data into the system. She personally has put 10 million records into the system, more because many records go in multiple times. And before I continue, I want to talk about Force 11. Force 11 is a reasonably new project. Next year we're having a conference Beyond the PDF 2, which is being run by Force 11. We don't know exactly the date. I think it'll be determined on October 26th. Is that right, Carol? I'm hoping that phone conversation gets that out. And I just want to say that Lee Dirks was on the organizing committee for this. I miss Lee Dirks. But Force 11 deals with things like nano publication, getting workflows into publications, that kind of publication, scientific communication of the future, which sits behind what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to exactly talk about that stuff. And here are three papers which, if you fall asleep during the talk, you can go back and read. The new one, Finding and Recommending Scholarly Articles, basically is the second half of the talk. The Emerging Scholarly Brain will be the first half of the talk, and since I wrote the paper, I made a reasonably long talk on it for Second Life, thanks to George, and I'm stealing most of the slides from that talk. And then 20 years ago, I wrote a paper on really intelligent information retrieval, which basically informs the first paper. I don't think I really thought of anything new since then, but we've done it as opposed to thinking about it. Well, first I'm going to start by talking about numbers, because numbers are not what I'm going to talk about. It's mostly what's being discussed in the rest of this meeting and the whole IEEE eScience stuff too, numbers. We are now dealing with enormous numbers of numbers, and we need to be able to understand them. Basically, I'm calling that machine-assisted perception. The Large Hadron Collider gets numbers, gets observations probably trillions of times faster than humans can perceive them, and somehow we have to perceive them so we make sense of them. Of course, that's the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. It's a model, a thing that actually doesn't exist yet, and it will have similar kinds of data rates, probably a little smaller, I think, than the LHC really, but they claim larger. Well, here is Kant pointing out that what we can conceive has a great deal to do with what we can perceive. And there's this interaction between what we can think and what we can see and perceive. So understanding and perception are very closely linked. And that's going to be part of the core of what I'm going to be talking about, although it won't seem such, I suspect, at the time. What I'm going to talk about, though, is words. Words are extremely complex, as anybody who's had to deal with an ontology can tell you, even from a computing point of view. Words have different meanings depending on the person hearing them, the person saying them, the time in which they're said or heard, and the general circumstances in which they're uttered or read. They're extremely complex, but they are how we actually communicate. We talk. We communicate via words. It's part of our DNA that we are able to communicate via words. We have millennia of evolution of communication. It's what makes us different from other kinds of animals. We've been communicating via written words for a very long time. Written symbols. This is a written symbol for communication. So is this. This is actually a scientific paper. It's a catalog of astronomical observations and the theory behind it. It's Babylonian astrology, right? That's basically what science was back then. So we've been doing this a very long time. It's just how we do things. It's how we think. Now I want to break for a second from talking about words and discuss the concept of the superorganism. You'll understand what I mean after a little bit. But superorganisms, like an ant colony, the highest level of the ant colony is the totality of its membership, rather than a particular set of superordinate individuals who direct the activities of members at lower levels. Ant colonies are not like armies. There's no general. There's no king. Everybody seems to know what to do, and everybody seems to do it, and they somehow communicate among each other how to do it well. And ants have been around a real long time. So have termites, so have bees, etc. That's a kind of superorganism, ants and ant colonies, bees and bee colonies, termites and termite colonies. They're all superorganisms, but so is human society at some level. We are all people who somehow interact and somehow get stuff done at a perhaps higher level than termites do, but we do. And society has many different branches. You can view it many different ways, but I'm going to look at scientific societies and view the scientific society as a type of superorganism where there is no leader, but stuff gets done. Where stuff gets done is stuff is figured out. And this is a picture from astronomical data analysis software and systems from 7 years ago, I guess. I'm in that picture somewhere, so is Alex Celery. The idea that anybody directs these people is completely wrong, but we do get stuff done. Science progresses. And that is the basis of what I'm going to be talking about. How do these superorganisms, how do we communicate? Well, bees communicate through this little dance that they are born knowing. They don't learn it, they're born knowing it. And they can go and tell other bees the direction to some flower of interest it's a waggle dance is what they call it. And it was figured out, I think, in the 50s. And it's been shown that they're born with it. They really don't learn it. Well, I'm going to now step forward a couple million years. In 1931, Olaf Stapleton, this is Olaf Stapleton, wrote a science fiction book about the next 2 million years of human evolution. And at the end of the book, at the end of the 2 million years, humans stop being humans and start being a new higher organism. And the conceit of the book is this higher organism is talking back through time to a human in 1931, basically now. And this is one of the things he says. The system of radiation, which embraces the whole planet and includes the million brains of the race, meaning the new, not human, but more than human race, becomes the physical basis of a racial self, meaning that all the brains together of all the now a little more than human people who are living there, that's the organism. Just the same way an ant colony is the organism, not any individual ant. The racial mind transcends the minds of groups and individuals. That's exactly what I'm saying here. And what we are doing and what I'm going to describe is our own interactions somehow with this larger mind that is what all of science is, what all of astrophysics is, what all of the eScience part of astrophysics is. We're not really just an anthill. We communicate, other than through waggle dances, we communicate primarily through books and printed words, at least until extremely recently, and mostly PDF and stuff like that is just an extension of this. We also communicate via wire. The invention of the telegraph, this is Morse's original telegraph. I work for the Smithsonian Institution, and they have that. That's why I got the picture. That is the big step in making distance not important. You don't have to physically carry the book. Information moves at the speed of light. And it abstracts it in a particular way. Everything since then is basically adding on to that. We have a couple 100 years of evolution, or 150 on that technology. And here's Moore's law again. In the 65 years since the transistor was invented, the power of computing and these kinds of technologies have gone up by a factor of about 10 to the, say, 13. 10 to the 1 every 5 years is about right. And I think Ian Foster showed a much longer time span than that. It really does still work. Well, we live at a very special time. Another 10 to the 13, and computers will be so fast that they will be doing thousands or millions of times the number of computations in a second as Avogadro's number, the number of atoms there are in a mole. It'll be the number of atoms there are in this room, or some number like that. That may not be physically achievable. Already, transistors are reaching the end of what's physically achievable with that kind of technology. But whenever that stops, explosions always stop eventually, and we're in the middle of it. We have a responsibility to ourselves, to our future, to get this pretty much right. Well, here's a picture of an artifact that's built by a superorganism. This is a termite mound somewhere in Africa, and it was built by a superorganism with many, 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 many individuals working over many, 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 many generations. And the thing is enormous compared to the size of a termite, of course. You can see the people there. Well, here's another artifact of a superorganism built by many, 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 many Parisians over many, many, many generations. And no single Parisian decided to build Paris. It was built. New York either. These things are artifacts of what superorganisms can do and have done. Well, what's the communication mode for how this superorganism, the one that built New York, how they communicated? Well, this is one of them, the New York Times. There are others, of course. We basically deal in print, but that's probably one of the most important ones in how New York is currently being built. Here's one of the communication methods for the construct, which is astrophysics. And here it isn't really a physical manifestation, the way, say, New York City is a physical artifact of the superorganism that built it. The artifact here is the intellectual construct. It's our knowledge of the universe and how the universe is built. And similarly with medicine or chemistry or biochemistry, it's our knowledge of how the body works. It's our knowledge of how life works. It's our knowledge of what energy is, what the basic structure of matter is. That's what the construct is that we're building, and we're still building. And this is one of the methods by which we communicate with the other members of our group. It's obviously more complex than rubbing antennae with pheromones, but that's the way we do it. Here is how we have memory. Without memory, this is a memory system for a superorganism, if you want to view it that way. Without memory, we'd be like the guy in Memento, always trying to figure out what is going on and trying to get forward. But we do have brains. We don't actually need a library of printed word in order to get stuff done. Before written language was invented, the basis of religion had been invented. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were spoken before they were written down, and spoken from generation to generation to generation. We are capable of doing really amazing things, but once we had a memory store, this is a memory store, we could do extraordinary things, and we are. New York City is an example. One of the things that you should think about these memory stores is that we can't use it all. It's physically impossible to read all the books there. It's one of the problems with the technology. And we've now overcome that. This is what the library looks like today. But 20 years ago, it looked like the last picture. Very few people in this room learned how to use a modern library as an undergraduate because they simply didn't exist 20 years ago. ADS is 20 years ago old essentially now. I showed it for the very first time in November of 1992. PubMed is younger than that. We predate PubMed by 4 or 5 years. Who would do research without PubMed or ADS now? Nobody. But we didn't learn it. The people who are coming up now, this is what they're learning. This is the future. Well, a thing like ADS can do something that couldn't be done with paper. We can say there are 125,000 papers in ADS, this is the real number, that contain the word redshift somewhere in the paper. Whether that does you any good or not in and of itself, that was impossible even to know. It's impossible to know a number that large, but it's trivial. You just make the query redshift and it comes back saying there are 125,000. How do you want to sort it? Well, okay. This is an interface to a library, and this is what I'm going to say is not really satisfactory for scientific use. The reason is really because we aren't ants. We don't rub pheromones on our antennae. We're extremely competent and thoughtful creatures, and we need to drive this. Basically, an information system, an information transfer system among members of a group of scientists needs to be a master-slave relation where the scientist is the master. This may change over time, but right now I think this has to be true, and it may never change. It may always be that we're the cognitive layer in this gigantic global brain. I mean, everybody put together. And the machine is just the inner part. And I'll have a little phrase that says that later. But here's an example of why Google doesn't work. This is a pretty typical query. Show me the paper by Dressler et al., which was referenced in the recent paper by Kurtz et al. On weak gravitational lensing. I'm about to show you how you do this in ADS, but anybody who wants to, try doing that in Google. The information is in Google. Every single thing in ADS is in Google. We give it to them, they take it. This is how you do it. You say caret Kurtz, that says first author is Kurtz, weak gravitational lensing. Sort it by most recent, but it turns out I only am first author on one paper that has it. That's it. Click on the link. That's the abstract. Look at the top. It says references. Click on that. Those are the references. Look down. It's in alphabetical order like all references. Get to Dressler. Find the link. Click on it. That's it. Look over to the right. It says publisher, PDF. Click on it, and there you go. In actual practice, it takes less than 30 seconds to do this. And the similar things in PubMed also take less than 30 seconds. It's about 30 seconds using Web of Science or Scopus or one of the other databases. ADS is not so peculiar in this regard. It's Google that's peculiar because it's trying to do something more than what the scientist actually wants them to do. It may be great for what it actually is for, of course. Try it with Google Scholar either. That doesn't work either. The idea that the scientist should direct it informs the design of this kind of system. The system it recommends things, you can browse, you can search. These are all basically one thing. What it is, it's a method for scientists to interact with the global memory, which is now the giant electronic database of all publications ever in astronomy or physics ADS actually has both, or medicine or whatever PubMed all has, and it's 21 million papers. We have a little less than 10 million. The Chemical Society database has more than 30 million. These are huge databases. You have to learn to interact with them. It's kind of like learning to use a slide rule or run an electron microscope or some other kind of talent that you have to develop in order to do research. The thing is, you have to make it so it can be developed. There can't be so steep a learning curve. So when you design a system like this, you have to keep that in mind, that it's the user that's going to direct the system. You don't want it to be too smart, or a user won't be able to figure out how to use it. Well, all right. Now I'm going to go and give the ADS demo. This is the front page of the new ADS system. Mostly you can do everything in it that you could do in the old system and some new things. I will break somewhere in the middle of the demo to show something you can't do in it yet, but will be able to, I hope, on December 1st to us and January 6th to the general public, but you can't do it yet. But anyway, you'll note that there are 7 different buttons here. And those are different sorting mechanisms and different query mechanisms. The query here, weak gravitational lensing, actually returns something like 5,000 different papers. You can't read all 5,000, so which ones do you really want? And how do you tell the system which ones you want? Well, most recent is the default for most systems like this. It's the most recent for PubMed and for Web of Science and Chem Abstracts and, I don't know, basically all the ones that are run by scientists. The next one down is most relevant, and that's sort of the secret sauce. That's how Google works. It's how Google Scholar works. We take the words, we take the number of citations, we take the number of downloads, we take the position of the words in the document, we take what kind of document it is, and we try and figure out what you might like to see. That's only partially successful, as you might imagine from what I've been talking about. Most cited is exactly that. The papers that are about weak gravitational lensing, you simply sort them by their number of citations. Now, we could do better than that. We could go and run a PageRank type algorithm on it, something like eigenfactor, so it weights the citations more or less depending on where they come from. And we choose not to do that because we want to make this simple. We want the user to understand what the user is doing here. Because, as I'll show you in a little bit, you can do very complex things with this, but these complex things can only be done if you understand what you're doing. They can't be done for you because we don't know in that kind of detail what you're going to want as a user. And when you think about it, getting something ranked by the eigenvalues of the principal eigenvector of the connectivity matrix, which is derived from the citation graph, is nowhere near as easy to understand as citations. That's why we do it. And finally, on the sorting methods, most popular, we simply rank by a number of recent downloads. And we only actually use downloads here by scientists. Something like a third to a half of all the downloads from ADS come from Wikipedia or Google or sometimes Bing. Not so often Bing, actually, because they don't index us yet. I'm sure of it. We basically throw all those out for this kind of thing, since we're really interested in what scientists are reading about. And, you know, we have plenty of scientists who use it. The next button, these are not sorts. These are secondary queries. The what people are reading button, what it does is it takes the most recent papers on this. They finds all the people who are reading it. It looks at what all those people have read and then sorts by the number of times a person who read a recent paper on this has read it. And that's really a different ranking completely than by most recent. And it's also different than most popular, because most popular only takes scientists, where what people are reading takes people who are reading those documents. And it doesn't have to do with weak gravitational lensing, as I'll show you. The next one, what people are citing, what experts are citing, that's what papers are cited the most in the most important papers. We actually use most relevant for that, on weak gravitational lensing. Those papers are normally not about weak gravitational lensing. They're about some sort of technique which is used when you're doing that kind of analysis. Some of them are mathematical, some of them are algorithmic, and some of them are directly having to do with weak lensing, and you'll see that too. And finally, reviews and introductory papers. Those are just the papers that cite the largest number of highly cited papers in the field. And that changes over time depending on what papers are heavily cited. Well, now I'll briefly tell you what the little boxes are on the right. The first one, that's the MyADS box, and that looks at archive for today. It's changed daily. Looks at your profile. We have a profile of all our major users and what they're interested in, and sorts archive according to your profile, and that's it. So those are probably the 10 most recent papers out today that you're most interested in, if we do it right. And it works pretty well. The recommendations, those are just, we run a few recommenders on the papers that you've recently looked at, trying to find very recent papers that we think will be of interest to you, and those are them. And then recently read is just a short-term memory, reminding you what you've read recently. I recently read my own paper on weak lensing, because I clicked on it to do the talk, Navarro's paper on automatic spectral classification, and a different weak lensing paper by Spinelli et al. All right, these are the results of the 7 different sorting mechanisms, search mechanisms, and you'll see that they're all different. These are the most recent papers. That would be, that's the default, and that's what people mostly get. But here we'll look at the most relevant papers, and these are very heavily weighted by citation and downloads. And you'll notice on top is the paper by Rees et al. Adam Rees won the Nobel Prize for this paper. It does say weak gravitational lensing in its abstract, but it says it as something that they looked at and found wasn't a source of systematic error in their finding that the universe is expansion is accelerating. So it's not really about it. But it is on top. It does have all the words. It does all that stuff. And the second one is Bartleman and Schneider's review paper from now 11 years ago on weak lensing. I won't say any more of them, but let's go to most cited. Most cited is also Rees et al. It does say weak lensing in the paper. And the second most citing is, again, Bartleman and Schneider, which is also pretty heavily downloaded. Along with other model papers. This is a really pretty interesting list. But most popular, the second paper on most popular is again Rees et al. He recently won the Nobel Prize. Everybody's reading that paper. The rest of these really do have to do with weak lensing in one way or another. A filament of dark matter between 2 clusters of galaxies. The weak lensing was used in that analysis, and that just came out in Nature and is downloaded extremely heavily. Well, let's go over to the second-order queries, the ones that take a list, find the people or the objects that are in the papers that are in the list, and then use them for a further query. This is what people are reading, and you'll notice that Rees et al. Is not in that list. People who are actually working and reading current papers in weak lensing aren't downloading Rees et al. Other scientists are, but people in that field already have read Rees et al. You know, I work in that field. I read Rees et al. When it came out. So it's not there. This is just what people are currently reading. So if you're, say, a student trying to figure out what's going on in the field, this is it. Here's what experts are citing. And the first one is Kaiser's paper, Kaiser, Squires, and Broadhurst. That's the principal method of actually doing these calculations from the image moments. People have been improving on it for the past decade and a half, but that's the fundamental paper. And the next one is Bartleman and Schneider's weak lensing review again. And then you keep going down. The number 3 has nothing whatsoever to do with weak lensing. It's how you build a model for a cluster of galaxies. Number 4 is how you measure little blobs in an image and determine whether they're galaxies or stars and what their ellipticities are. And numbers 4 and 5 are testing programs or simulations of weak lensing. These are all very useful programs, papers rather. They're not directly about a weak lensing result. Finally, reviews and introductory papers. These are all review articles. It really does work to do this, but you'll notice that none of these papers are Bartleman and Schneider. Bartleman and Schneider is way too old to be on this list. It's actually number 35 on the list, ranked in order of number of papers that they cite. The top one is Bartleman's new review. Somewhere down here, number 7 is Schneider's review from about 7 years ago, and all the rest are more recent reviews. 2010, 28, 2010, 28, 2010, 2011, and then 2005. You get recent reviews when it works, and it works in this case. Okay, I'm going to go now one real example of how you can use this to get something really pretty sophisticated out. And here I'm going to use the same query, weak gravitational lensing. And you already saw this. This is the most recent list. Well, now I'm going to filter it. And I won't explain how facets work. You all know about facets there on the left. But I'm going to go and say I want papers that have data from the Space Telescope. And you'll notice all the data facets over there, CDS, ESA, MAST, NED. Different librarians are responsible for every one of those facets. And they feed the data into ADS. And then I'm going to say, and I want papers that are about Abell 383. Which is a big cluster of galaxies that has a strong lens in it and a lot of weak lensing studies. And further, I'm going to say I only want papers this year, which is further down. And I get these 5 papers. Okay? That itself is a pretty sophisticated text mining and, what's the word? Semantic tagging project. Because these have to be semantically tagged. They're tagged by a bunch of librarians in Paris who shipped the data to Strasbourg. This query went to Strasbourg and came back with, with all these lists. They have to be tagged as having to do with Space Telescope data. That's done by a librarian in Baltimore. And then those tags have to be combined along with the words, weak gravitational lensing, and the dates. And you get that. Well, okay, now we have it. What can you do with it? Well, here's where I have to go and actually use the old system. But I'm not going to show you the old system. I'll show you this picture, which hopefully in December will be real, which is basically the same as the last picture, but it has all these buttons on top that will do what it is I'm about to do. This is done by Jay Luker, who is the one who's actually implementing this. You can expand this and do more, but in order to do what I want, you wouldn't actually have to. And what I'm going to do here, and this is the result, is I'm going to say, find all the people who read those 5 papers, find the papers that they have read the most in the last three months, and sort them by which papers are the most heavily read by those people. And these are the top 7, and they all really do have to do with it. The first one is a recent theoretical result looking at basically something that's quite important if you're looking at this exact problem. The second one, the third one, the 5th one, and the 7th one are by different groups, all of whom are working on the study of Abell 383 and its weak lensing. Well, to conclude, I'll go to the second one. The reason is because I'm one of the authors, although I'm way down on the list of 36 authors. I think I'm actually 2 more after this. You'll note that on the top you can get the references, the citations, the reads, similar articles, all the kind of things that the buttons did you can do for a single article and have that be the query instead of making the query yourself. You can do this from this page. On the right, you can go to the article itself. You can go to the archive ePrint, because the article is behind the paywall still. You can go and get data products from Simbad. You can get the archival data. In this case, I think it's from Space Telescope. We have a whole bunch of suggestions as to possible things you might want to read if you're interested in this paper. I think in Pittsburgh eScience, I discussed how those work, so I won't do it now. But that's pretty much the end point. Normally, you bring up the paper and read it at that point. So, what have we just done? We have, in the last example, it's not just text mining. We've mined the consciousness of everybody working in the field. We don't just have a list made by looking at metadata and sorting. We have a list made by looking at metadata and sorting of people and the documents. So we now have the collective intelligence of the people working in the field telling us what it is we ought to read or at least be aware of. Here, Jung's famous book on the collective unconscious. We are really building what I like to call the lizard brain of a new organism, the organism being all of us put together along with the machines. Kind of like in The First and Last Men. Here you can see what I meant by conceive and perceive. We are really making this a much more rapid, we perceive, we conceive, we perceive, we conceive, as is all the stuff having to do with numbers that I'm not discussing, but all the rest of the conference is discussing in spades. That's what we're doing now, and it's being enabled by basically this Moore's Law explosion of capabilities that's happening in our lifetimes. So finally, we'll go back to The First and Last Men, Olafsson, and what he says, for all the daily business of life then, each of us is mentally a distinct individual. We all think we are. Though his ordinary means of communications is telepathic. Well, this is my ordinary means of communications with my wife when I'm not right there. We're still pretty much telepathic. Let me see whether I can get this on before I continue. But frequently he wakes up in a group mind. Okay, we don't exactly do that yet. Maybe we will in 1,000,000 years, or maybe 100. I don't know. We're actually going much faster than Olafsson was predicting, because he said this would take 2,000,000 years to happen. Of this, obviously, I can tell you nothing, save that it differs from the lowlier state more radically than the infant mind differs from the mind of the individual adult, and that it consists of insight into many unsuspected and previously inconceivable features of the familiar world of men and things. If you think about the difference between what an individual can do, building something, and New York City, you start getting the sense of what it is that we're about to achieve. Thank you. Okay, not bad.
And so we have time for questions.
Well, I like, of course, your metaphor or analogy. I'm not sure if it's ontogeny or phylogeny, but anyway, we have certainly outsourced our collective memory to cyberspace, search engines and everything else. But cognitive functions, well, we can harvest some of it in the way that you described. Citizen science tries to harvest some of it in a different way. But that's about all that we've done so far. And something that I always keep harping about is that most likely in the amazing, complex, ever more complex data sets that we collect, there are meaningful structures that are beyond individual human comprehension in many dimensions, or strange topology, whatever. And so there, I think, would be the really interesting new application of machine learning, machine intelligence in what Licklider back 50 years ago called collaborative human-computer discovery. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I basically agree. The things unsuspected and previously inconceivable, it's exactly what that is, right? And I think that will happen. I think we are on the verge of radically changing the way we actually think because of the influence of machines. And it's not like conceive and perceive are really different things. It's not like we think in words and don't see, say, the computer graphics kind of realization of huge data sets, and these are separate. They are combined. We are just one thing. We're individual people, but we are changing the way we think. We're changing it radically. I can look up how to get to this hotel on my little phone, right? I don't need to actually think of it at all. I can assume that I can remember it because I can by typing it into the phone when I'm on the subway. That's a change in how I think. 10 years ago, I would have had to go and plan it. Well, we're only at the beginning of this. The explosion is still going on. In 40 years, if the Moore's Law stuff keeps on going, what's 10 to the 8th? It's an enormous difference in our power. We can't imagine it. We actually can't imagine it any more than somebody could imagine, except at this level, what we're doing now. They can't really imagine how it would happen. And I think that's really it, that there are going to be things that we can't imagine that we can suddenly perceive and conceive. Okay, I think you were first and then Carol.
Hi, great talk. And I love where you're going with this. I do have one observation, though. Back in the dim last millennia, I was working in Japan, and I created a bunch of neural net programs that mined a lot of data, early back in 1991. And we created a system that was way more accurate than the commercial system at the time of what that particular company did. So it was very successful. But one of the things we discovered was we had a never-ending problem with overlearning. As in, even though we had a huge amount of data, unless we injected some randomness into the learning procedures, we found ourselves overlearning on certain patterns. What do you think about throwing in some random returns every now and then, just to keep people from just always following the crowd, but push them sideways every now and then?
Well, I think it's not necessary, and the reason is because the actual statistics, when you get down to what people really do, are so low that just random fluctuations are going to happen naturally. A paper that's 12 years old, actually 8 years old, is downloaded approximately once a month. That's the median number from the Astrophysical Journal. So if you're looking at download statistics, as we do, either you have to aggregate, and there's a great deal of error involved in the aggregation, and or you have very small numbers. Both leave room for huge error. So I think we don't have to inject error. We have so much error anyway. But I do understand what you're saying and believe you're right, that if, in fact, you have so much data on something that you can predict it, you're not predicting it anymore. You're basically forcing the result, and it's probably going to be wrong.
So I was going to follow up on that. How do we stimulate the maverick? Because you were talking here about telling us where things were going and where people were concentrating. And my astronomers I'm working with want to know where they should be looking that nobody else is. So because what's the point of looking where everybody is? That's looking under the lamppost because that's where the light is. You want to look somewhere else. That's where you might find out something that's a little bit different, that they'll be able to make their name. So how do we stop this kind of just following the crowd, and we empower mavericks instead?
Well, I think that people who have a vision for what they can figure out and what's new are the people who actually get ahead. So I suspect that what we're doing, viewed from that perspective, is keeping people who are going to be dull. And maybe better informed dull, but still dull. Okay, I'm all in favor of those guys leaving the field anyway. So I don't suspect, though, that that's exactly what will happen. I think that knowing what all your competitors are doing makes you work harder. and makes you look for something they're not doing, and they're seeing what you're doing and looking for something you're not doing. So I suspect that that kind of thing will spur this kind of innovation. Because you'll see, well, if we don't get this done in the next 2 months, these guys are already doing it, so why don't we do this instead, because we can't get it done in 2 months. And then you have to think of something new. So I suspect that that will dominate over the, let's all do the same thing, which seems to me what everybody is doing anyway. I'm kind of bored by the journals.
I wonder whether you had any thoughts on education, because the way we think is so shaped by those early years. And at the moment, kids are doing some of this stuff, but they're doing it in the hour after they've finished their homework before they go to sleep. Because when they're in school, they're taught to solve problems in isolation, to rely on their own knowledge. They're not allowed to get online. They don't work in teams very often. You know, knowledge is presented in silos and so on. So I would imagine that, do you think that we should change the education system to support this change in thinking?
My short answer is yes. The ability to work with this stuff, as I pointed out, 20 years ago, not a single person used things like this because they didn't exist. 20 or 30 years from now, people will look at this stuff and say how incredibly old-fashioned that is, but not so old-fashioned as something that had existed for ever since the Babylonian times, which is just writing down basically a scientific paper on, in that case it was stone, but writing it down on paper. But still, it's pretty primitive. We're only just now doing this. I mean, the people who are inventing this are alive today. So we're not looking at something that's old. It's very new and changing rapidly. So kids will grow up learning some of the basic things, but they're going to have to invent the future too. And until this exponential growth stops, the future will continue changing very, very fast, as it didn't for thousands of years till now, or at least till Gutenberg.
Let me try to offer a different answer to Carol's question.
Okay.
I think it's important to distinguish between text mining and numbers mining. Right? In text, there is that danger of following the bulk. But I thought that probably the greatest promise of semantic technologies is to discover automatically chains that would not be obvious.
Right.
And maybe there will be a way of doing that.
Oh, I'm sure there will.
Right. And in terms of mining the numbers, well, it's a clustering analysis, anomaly searches, and so on. In some problems, you want the bulk of the distribution, like you want as many normal galaxies as you want to do something. In others, you look for outliers, and we know how to do this. This is a well-defined problem. Doesn't mean it's easy, but we know how to do it.
Right. Let's see. So, Carol?
You go ahead, Tony.
I was going to introduce a slightly different theme.
Oh, okay. So one of the big problems I have with my PhD students is they overthink and they have analysis paralysis. They have so much stuff that if they only knew the next paper, only read the next thing that just came up, then they would just know what to do next. And eventually, in the old days, I used to take away their library card and say, okay, now you're not allowed to go to the library. You're not allowed to read anything else. You've got to think. And now somehow I've got to take away their Google, which is, of course, impossible. But there is a point where sometimes it's just too much to know, and it's better to know none of it. And one of my colleagues, Jim Austin, who many of you will know, gave up reading the literature some years ago because he just said, it just got too depressing. And he's been more creative ever since.
I do admit that I had no clue what was in the, say, information retrieval literature, the entire existence of which I was unaware of when I invented ADS. So basically, I agree with you.
So you postulate this change on the extraordinary changes due to Moore's law and the capability, and that's certainly been true over the last 30-odd years. But when we get down, another 10 years out, you'll be down at atomic dimensions. It's unlikely that there will be, in my view, that there'll be the same sort of growth. It'd be like air travel, where you actually go to a maximum speed and airplanes don't go much faster. So that's, I think, where you'll get. But you seem to be postulating something like Kurzweil's singularity. I wonder what your thoughts were on singularity.
I really don't exactly believe in Kurzweil's singularity, because I think people will keep ahead of that. But I agree that if we don't invent something beyond a transistor, we don't have very much longer from Moore's law. And that may be true. That's why I say we really live in a peculiar time. Historically, on a 1,000-year time scale, this is a peculiar time, because this is when the explosion is taking place. And if we invent something new, we only have another couple of decades before we start running into really fundamental things. That's why I said Avogadro's number. Because, in fact, can you imagine a physical system that is more complex than all the atoms in the room that it's in? Probably not. I mean, maybe you can do it. Maybe there are ways to deal with the quantum mechanical eigenstates, etc. But no, that's so far science fiction that I don't know. But to talk about the singularity, no, I like things. I don't think we're going to live forever, and I don't think that machines are going to replace us.
And the follow-up was, before George pinched the microphone, was about Watson and Jeopardy. You haven't mentioned that type of approach.
Sure. I just view that as a technological twist on what's going on. All those things are going to be used. With another factor of 10 or 100, that kind of thing is going to be cheap. The stuff we have today will be, in your wristwatch or in your cell phone. So we will have that kind of thing. I'm thinking that the stuff I'm showing is what we can do today. And you can do better than that if you have a big computer. But these are done on mini computers. You can actually run this stuff on a PC with no problem at all. Yes?
Going back to your model of the superorganism, you talked about this system where each individual is, in a sense, mindless, which, of course, doesn't compare to humans directly. But you said there were no real masters there. There was no hierarchy. And yet, when you come to the scientific communication, scholarly communication, you clearly have your experts and the people that are leaders, thought leaders. So how do you reconcile those two different approaches in what you see as the future versus what you're, in a sense, throwing out all the dull people that aren't really contributing anything?
Well, throwing out all the dull people is different from there being a hierarchy in science. The hierarchy in science is rather loose, really. I mean, the people in the National Academy of Science may get better funded, but they don't necessarily have better ideas once they're there. They got there because they had ideas when they were young. So I don't agree that there is this kind of hierarchy of very established individuals, because this is a thought process. It's not a resource gathering process. People who think of the new things are the ones who are really contributing the most to this sort of intellectual edifice, which is, astrophysics or neuroscience or medicine or whatever little mini superorganisms we want to go and look at. There's obviously a limit to where you can say we're a superorganism like ants. So pushing the analogy too far is pushing it too far. But I think it's an interesting thing to look at, in that we are mostly independent operators. I mean, I don't do what I do because George tells me to. But there are structures. We build structures. New York City has a mayor. It's not like there is no superordinate individual who tells the garbage collectors where to collect garbage. There is. But over a period of centuries, there's no superordinate individual in New York City. There are lots of mayors. They come and go. There are lots of people. But it still gets built. And decisions get made, and there's a whole decision process, and that's true of science, too.
Well, somebody once called the singularity the rapture of the geeks. I thought this was very good. And another point I've heard somewhere is that on this planet, singularity already happened, and it's us, if you look at the rapid acceleration of the evolutionary pace. Humans are very new compared to, say, single-cell organisms. But, okay, so I am a radical cyber evolutionist, to coin a word, but here's a counter-argument. It's been estimated that's probably good to factors of 10 or something, that an exaflop machine would have processing power of human brain, however that is defined. To power such a machine by the present scaling laws will take about 1 gigawatt. Now, the carbon-based computer in your head dissipates 25 watts, so 8 orders of magnitude more efficient. So obviously there is a very profound difference in the algorithms that carbon-based computers use versus those that we force on silicon-based ones.
All right. Yes. And that may be where our factors of 10 every 5 years continue to come from, if in fact that happens. We'll see. So far as I know, that kind of problem is being worked on extremely heavily, by people like Google and Microsoft with their own power plants and 2% of all the electricity in the world, and however that works. But will they solve it? Will they solve it at the level of several orders of magnitude over the next 20 or 30 years? Maybe they will. Maybe, in fact, that's what's going to happen, and the amount of computing will stop going up, but the ability to have it all over the place will, and then multiplex. I can't predict the future at that level any more than anybody else in the room, and we all can write science fiction novels. I hope. Anybody else?
Okay, thank you, Michael. I want to let you all know that we don't have a coffee break after this, although we do have 15 minutes. So if there's coffee, you're welcome to it. But the poster session will start in the next room at 4:30. And thank you once again.